The dust-coated window of the stagecoach filtered the harsh Arizona sun as Clara Calloway pressed her forehead against the glass, watching the vast, unforgiving landscape roll by. Her once elegant traveling dress was now wrinkled and stained from the 4-day journey, but her posture remained rigid, betraying the proper Eastern upbringing she was now fleeing. It was 1876, and at 22 years old, Clara had left behind everything familiar to escape the memory of her father's gambling debts and the unwanted advances of his creditor. "White Rock Station coming up, miss," the driver called down. "Last stop before Copper Springs." Clara straightened her back and gathered her modest belongings, a carpetbag containing 2 dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, and exactly $47 hidden in the lining of her corset. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, sending dust billowing around the windows. "Need any help with your bags, miss?" asked a gruff voice as the door swung open. "No, thank you," Clara replied, stepping carefully down onto the sun-baked earth. "I can manage." The station was little more than a weathered building with a sagging porch, surrounded by a few outbuildings and corrals. Men in dusty clothes milled about, eyeing the stagecoach and its lone female passenger with undisguised curiosity. Clara ignored their stares, holding her head high as she made her way to the station house. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Clara approached the counter where a balding man was sorting through mail. "Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for passage to Copper Springs. I understand it's another day's journey from here." The man looked up, surprise evident in his rheumy eyes. "Copper Springs? Ain't much there for a lady like yourself. What business you got out there?" "I've been hired as the new schoolteacher," Clara lied smoothly, the story she had practiced countless times on the journey west. "I'm expected next week." The man snorted. "Copper Springs ain't had a school for nigh on 3 years, miss." "Not since the silver mine dried up and half the town moved on." Clara felt her carefully constructed plan crumbling. "But I received a letter. There must be some mistake." "No mistake. Whoever wrote you that letter was having themselves a joke at your expense." He eyed her more carefully. "You got people waiting for you somewhere else." "Family? No," Clara admitted, her voice barely audible. "No one." The afternoon stretched into evening, and Clara found herself seated on a bench outside the station house, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Her options were dwindling with the daylight. She could return east on the next stagecoach if she could afford the fare, but there was nothing waiting for her there except humiliation and worse. "Madam, you planning on sitting there all night?" Clara looked up to see a tall man silhouetted against the sunset. As he stepped closer, she could make out broad shoulders under a worn leather vest, a weathered face partially hidden by several days' growth of beard, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "I'm considering my options, sir," Clara replied stiffly. "Don't reckon you've got many from the looks of it." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "Name's Vaughn Laramie. I run cattle about 20 miles north of here." "Clara Calloway," she replied, nodding slightly. "Aye, it seems I've been misled about a teaching position in Copper Springs." Vaughn Laramie's weathered face softened slightly. "Copper Springs ain't been much more than a ghost town these past 2 years. Someone played you for a fool, Miss Calloway." "So I've been informed." Clara blinked back tears of frustration. "Unfortunately, that leaves me in rather dire circumstances." Vaughn studied her for a long moment. "You can cook." "I beg your pardon, can you cook?" "My ranch hands are about ready to stage a mutiny over my biscuits, and my housekeeper left 2 months ago to marry a shopkeeper in Tucson." He straightened his shoulders. "It's honest work, Miss Calloway. 3 meals a day for 6 men, keeping the house in order." "You'd have your own room and fair wages." Clara stared at him, weighing her limited options against this unexpected offer. I can cook reasonably well, Mr. Laramie, though I've never done so for a large group. More than you can do sitting on this bench waiting for Providence." He gestured toward a wagon loaded with supplies. "I'm heading back to the ranch at first light. You're welcome to join me if you've made up your mind by then." As Vaughn walked away, Clara felt a strange mix of apprehension and relief. The offer was unexpected and potentially dangerous. She knew nothing about this man or his ranch. Yet the alternative was returning east in disgrace or trying to make her way alone in this harsh territory. By the time dawn broke over the station, Clara had made her decision. She stood beside the wagon, her carpetbag clutched tightly in her gloved hands, as Vaughn Laramie approached. "You're certain about this?" he asked, studying her face in the early morning light. "I don't have many alternatives, Mr. Laramie," Clara replied honestly. "But I give you my word that I'll work hard and earn my keep." Vaughn nodded once, then helped her up onto the wagon seat. "It's rough country, Miss Calloway, different from what you're used to." "I'm tougher than I look," she said, settling her skirts around her. The journey to the Laramie ranch took the better part of the day, winding through rugged terrain that gradually gave way to open grassland dotted with scrub oak and mesquite. Clara found herself captivated by the raw beauty of the landscape, so different from the manicured gardens and crowded streets of Philadelphia. "That's Broken Spur," Vaughn said late in the afternoon, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills. "Been in my family for almost 15 years now. My father came out here in '61, started with 20 head of longhorns and built it up to over 500 before he passed." Clara took in the sprawling ranch with interest. A large main house constructed of timber and stone formed the centerpiece, with a bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings arranged nearby. Corrals held horses of different colors, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "It's impressive," she said sincerely. "How long have you been managing it alone?" 5 years this October," Vaughn replied, his voice taking on a more somber tone. "Pa died in a flash flood while moving cattle to higher ground. My mother had already passed by then." "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said softly. As they approached the main house, several men emerged from the bunkhouse, curious about the newcomer. Vaughn introduced them briefly: Sam, the grizzled foreman who'd worked for his father; Miguel and Luis, brothers from Mexico who handled the horses; Thomas, a young cowhand barely older than Clara; and Ali, the oldest of the group at nearly 50, who served as cook until his rheumatism got too bad. "Miss Calloway's going to be taking over the cooking and housekeeping," Vaughn announced. "I expect you all to show her the same respect you'd give your own mothers or sisters." The men nodded, though Clara caught several exchanging skeptical glances. She couldn't blame them. Her neat traveling dress and polished manners hardly suggested someone who could manage the rigors of ranch life. Vaughn showed Clara to a small but clean room off the kitchen. "It ain't much, but it's private. The men sleep in the bunkhouse and my room's upstairs. Nobody will bother you here." "Thank you," Clara said, setting down her carpetbag. "When would you like me to begin with my duties?" "The men are usually up before dawn, breakfast at sunup, dinner at noon, supper after the day's work is done." He hesitated. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came west, Miss Calloway. If it doesn't suit you after a few weeks, I'll see you get safely to Tucson where you might find work more fitting for a lady." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Laramie, but I've made my choice. I'll do my best to meet your expectations." That evening, Clara took inventory of the kitchen supplies and began planning meals for the coming days. The pantry was well stocked with basics: flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and dried fruits, though lacking in the finer ingredients she was accustomed to using. Still, she was determined to prove her worth. Her first breakfast was a nervous affair, serving up biscuits, fried salt pork, and strong coffee to men who regarded her with curious eyes. By the third day, however, she had settled into a routine, and the ranch hands began to warm to her presence, particularly after she mastered a recipe for sourdough bread that even the critically pronounced passable. Vaughn remained something of a mystery to Clara. He was unfailingly polite, but maintained a certain distance, often eating quickly before heading out to work or retiring to his study after supper to review the ranch ledgers. Still, she caught him watching her sometimes with an unreadable expression that made her pulse quicken. 2 weeks into her stay at Broken Spur, Clara was kneading dough for the next day's bread when the sound of shouting drew her to the window. Vaughn and Sam were riding hard toward the ranch, followed by Thomas, who was slumped in his saddle, clutching his arm. Clara rushed outside as the men dismounted. Thomas's face was ashen, blood seeping through his fingers where he gripped his upper arm. "What happened?" she asked, already moving to support Thomas as he swayed on his feet. "Rustlers," Vaughn said grimly, helping to guide Thomas toward the house. Tom tried to head them off and caught a bullet for his trouble. Clara helped settle Thomas on the kitchen table while Vaughn gathered supplies. "I've dealt with injuries before," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "My father was accident-prone." Vaughn gave her an appraising look but stepped back to let her work. Clara cut away Thomas's bloodied shirt to reveal a deep furrow across his upper arm. "The bullet went through clean," she said, examining the wound carefully. "It needs cleaning and stitching, but he should heal if infection doesn't set in." She looked up at Vaughn. "Do you have whiskey and needle and thread?" While Vaughn fetched the items, Clara spoke softly to Thomas, distracting him with questions about his hometown in Missouri. By the time she finished cleaning and stitching the wound, the young cowboy was pale but steadier. "You've got a gentle touch, Miss Clara," Thomas said gratefully as she bandaged his arm. "Barely felt the needle," Clara smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. "Rest now. I'll bring you some broth later." When the men had cleared out, Vaughn lingered in the kitchen doorway. "You handled that well. Not many ladies would stay steady at the sight of so much blood." Clara began cleaning up the mess. "My mother died when I was 14. I learned quickly that squeamishness is a luxury few can afford." "What brought you west, Clara?" Vaughn asked quietly. "The real reason, not the story about a teaching position." Clara stilled, her back to him as she considered how much to reveal. "My father died 6 months ago. He left significant debts. One of his creditors offered to forgive those debts in exchange for my hand in marriage, and you ran." Clara turned to face him. "He was 30 years my senior with a reputation for cruelty toward his servants and livestock. Yes, I ran, with what little money I could gather." Vaughn's expression darkened. "No one's coming after you." "I don't believe so. The scandal of a jilted suitor would damage his standing more than the loss of the money." She straightened her shoulders. "I apologize for the deception, Mr. Laramie." "If you wish me to leave, no," Vaughn interrupted. "Your reasons are your own. You've earned your place here fair and square." His gaze softened slightly. "And after today, I reckon you've earned the right to call me Vaughn, at least when it's just us talking." As spring gave way to summer, Clara found herself settling into life at Broken Spur with surprising ease. Her cooking improved as she experimented with local ingredients, and she took pride in maintaining the ranch house, bringing order to rooms that had clearly lacked a woman's touch for years. The men grew accustomed to her presence, removing their hats when she entered a room and moderating their language most of the time. Vaughn remained somewhat distant, though Clara noticed small changes in their interactions. He began lingering over meals, occasionally sharing stories about the ranch's early days or asking her opinion on matters like replanting the neglected kitchen garden. Sometimes in the evenings, she would find him on the porch watching the sunset, and he would invite her to join him, the two of them sitting in companionable silence as darkness fell. One sweltering July afternoon, Clara was hanging laundry when she spotted riders approaching from the east, 3 men she didn't recognize. She hurried inside to alert Vaughn, who was reviewing accounts in his study. "Probably just passing through," he said, though his hand moved instinctively to check the revolver at his hip. "Stay inside, Clara." From the window, Clara watched as Vaughn walked out to meet the strangers. Their conversation appeared tense, with the lead rider a tall man in an expensive black coat, despite the heat doing most of the talking while gesturing emphatically. After several minutes, Vaughn shook his head firmly, and the men rode away, though not before the leader turned to stare at the house with an expression that sent a chill through Clara even at a distance. That evening, Vaughn was unusually quiet during supper. When Clara brought coffee to his study afterward, she found him staring into the fireplace, his expression troubled. "Those men today," she said, setting down the tray. "Who were they?" Vaughn sighed heavily. "James Blackwood and his associates. He owns the Double Bar Ranch about 30 miles south. Been trying to buy me out for 2 years now. And you don't want to sell. This land is Laramie land," Vaughn said firmly. "My father worked himself to death building this place. I won't dishonor his memory by selling to a man like Blackwood." Clara settled into a chair across from him. "What kind of man is he?" "The kind who takes what he wants and doesn't much care how he gets it." Vaughn's jaw tightened. 3 smaller ranchers in the territory have sold to him in the past year, all after mysterious cattle deaths or dried-up water sources. "You think he's sabotaging them to force sales?" I know he is, can't prove it though. Vaughn looked at her directly. Blackwood's not the type to give up easily. Things might get difficult around here. Clara held his gaze. I'm not afraid of difficult, Vaughn. Something shifted in his expression, then a softening around the eyes, a hint of admiration. No, I don't suppose you are, Clara Calloway. The threat from Blackwood materialized 3 weeks later when Miguel discovered 2 dead cattle near the creek, their throats cut. Over the next month, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency, fences cut, a small grass fire that nearly reached the barn, and most concerning, the poisoning of one of the ranch's water sources. Tension mounted at Broken Spur as the men began taking turns standing watch at night. Clara often found herself unable to sleep, listening for unusual sounds and worrying about Vaughn, who grew more grim-faced and determined with each new act of sabotage. One evening in late August, a fierce thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Clara was in the kitchen preparing to start supper when the door burst open and Sam staggered in, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Where's Vaughn?" he gasped. "Checking the north pasture," Clara replied, alarmed by his appearance. "What's happened?" Rustlers hit the east herd. Took maybe 50 head. Vaughn needs to know they're heading toward Blackwood's land. Clara made a quick decision. "You're exhausted, Sam. I'll find Vaughn. Which way to the north pasture?" Sam hesitated, but another clap of thunder seemed to decide him. "Follow the creek north about 2 miles. Can't miss him, he'll be near the old oak stand." Grabbing Vaughn's spare slicker from a hook by the door, Clara hurried to the stable. She hadn't ridden much before coming to Broken Spur, but necessity had made her a passable horsewoman. She saddled the gentlest mare in the stable and set out into the storm, rain lashing against her face as lightning split the sky. The creek was swollen with rainwater, making the journey treacherous. Twice Clara nearly lost her seat when the mare shied at thunder, but she pressed on, following the waterway north as Sam had instructed. Finally, through the curtain of rain, she spotted a rider beneath a cluster of oak trees. "Vaughn," she called, urging the mare forward. He turned, surprise and then alarm crossing his features as he recognized her. "Clara, what the hell are you doing out in this?" Sam returned. "Rustlers took cattle from the east herd," she shouted over the storm. "They're heading toward Blackwood's land," Vaughn cursed under his breath. "How many men?" Sam didn't say. "He was exhausted. I told him I'd find you." Lightning flashed, illuminating Vaughn's face, a mixture of anger and concern. "You shouldn't have come out in this storm. It's dangerous." There wasn't time to. Clara's words cut off as a deafening crack of thunder coincided with a lightning strike on a nearby tree. The mare reared in panic, throwing Clara backward into the rain-swollen creek. The cold water knocked the breath from her lungs as the current immediately began dragging her downstream. Clara flailed, trying to find purchase on the slippery creek bed, but the rushing water was too powerful. Through the roar of the storm, she heard Vaughn shouting her name. Suddenly, strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her against the current. Vaughn had dismounted and waded into the creek, battling the water to reach her. With tremendous effort, he dragged her to the bank, both of them collapsing onto the muddy ground. "Clara." His voice was ragged as he brushed soaked hair from her face. "Are you hurt?" she coughed, expelling creek water. "No, I don't think so." Relief washed over his features, quickly replaced by anger. "That was foolish, coming out here alone. You could have been killed." "The ranch was in danger," Clara said, struggling to sit up. "You needed to know. Not at the cost of your safety." The vehemence in his voice startled her. Vaughn seemed to realize it too, because he took a deep breath before continuing more calmly. "The cattle can be replaced, you can't." Something in his tone made Clara's heart skip. She looked up into his face, rain streaming down his features, and saw naked concern in his eyes and something else that made her breath catch. The moment stretched between them, the storm momentarily forgotten. Then Vaughn cleared his throat and helped her to her feet. "We need to get you back to the ranch before you catch your death." They rode double on Vaughn's horse, Clara seated in front of him with his arms around her to hold the reins. The solid warmth of his chest against her back was both comforting and unsettling, awakening feelings she had been trying to ignore for weeks. By the time they reached the ranch, the storm was beginning to abate. Sam and the other hands rushed out to meet them, alarmed by Clara's bedraggled appearance. "Get a hot bath ready for Miss Calloway," Vaughn ordered as he lifted her down from the horse. To Clara, his voice softened. You need to get warm and dry immediately. Later, after soaking in a copper tub filled with heated water, Clara sat wrapped in blankets before the fire in her room. A soft knock at the door announced Vaughn, bearing a steaming cup. Whiskey with honey, he explained, offering it to her. My mother's remedy for avoiding chest colds after a drenching. Clara accepted the cup gratefully. Thank you for the drink and for saving me from the creek. Vaughn remained standing, his expression troubled. Why did you do it, Clara? Risk yourself like that? She considered her answer carefully. Because broken spur matters to you, which means it matters to me too. I couldn't sit safely inside while everything you care about was threatened. Vaughn studied her face for a long moment. You've become important to the ranch, to all of us. And you've all become important to me, Clara replied softly. More than I expected when I arrived. Something unspoken hung in the air between them. Vaughn took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it. You should rest. We'll deal with the rustlers tomorrow. As he turned to leave, Clara called after him. Vaughn, be careful. Blackwood seems like a man who doesn't mind playing with fire. So am I when something worth protecting is at stake, he answered, his gaze lingering on her face before he closed the door. The following weeks brought escalating tensions with the Double Bar Ranch. Vaughn and his men recovered most of the stolen cattle, finding them mixed with Blackwood's herds, but the confrontation nearly turned violent. Only the timely arrival of a passing U.S. Marshal prevented bloodshed, though the lawman warned that his jurisdiction was limited without clear evidence of wrongdoing. September arrived with relentless heat that parched the land and frayed tempers. Clara found herself watching Vaughn with growing concern as he drove himself and his men hard, extending patrols and sleeping little. The distance that had begun to close between them seemed to widen again as Vaughn retreated into grim determination. One evening, Clara was startled from sleep by the smell of smoke. She rushed to her window to see flames leaping from the roof of the barn. Grabbing her shawl, she ran outside where the ranch hands were already forming a bucket line from the well. The horses. Vaughn shouted, running toward the burning structure. Get them out! Clara joined the effort, filling buckets and passing them along the line. The fire grew despite their efforts, consuming the dry wood with frightening speed. Miguel and Louis managed to free most of the horses, but the flames had taken hold too strongly to save the building. As dawn broke, the ranch hands stood exhausted before the smoldering ruins. Clara distributed coffee, taking particular note of Vaughn's soot-streaked face and the hard set of his jaw. This wasn't an accident, he said when she approached. Someone set that fire deliberately. Blackwood, who else? Vaughn's hands tightened around the coffee cup. He's getting bolder. Next time it could be the house, with all of us sleeping inside. Clara laid a gentle hand on his arm. What will you do? End this, he said simply, one way or another. That afternoon, Vaughn called the men together. Clara stood at the edge of the group, listening as he outlined his plan. Blackwood thinks he can scare us off or wear us down, Vaughn told them. He's wrong. I'm riding to Tucson tomorrow to speak with Judge Porter about getting a legal injunction against the Double Bar. Sam, you'll be in charge while I'm gone. You shouldn't go alone, Sam argued. Blackwood's men control too much of the territory between here and Tucson. I need you here protecting the ranch, Vaughn countered. And Clara, he added, his eyes briefly meeting hers. That night, unable to sleep, Clara found Vaughn on the porch, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. She settled beside him on the bench, watching his practiced movements. Is there nothing I can say to dissuade you from going alone? She asked quietly. This needs to end, Clara, the legal way if possible. And if not, Vaughn set aside the gun, then I'll do what needs doing. Clara studied his profile in the dim light. There are other options. You could sell the ranch, start fresh somewhere else. Run, you mean? His voice hardened. This land is more than property to me. It's my father's legacy, my home. He turned to face her fully. Would you have me abandon it? I would have you alive, Clara replied simply. Something shifted in Vaughn's expression. He reached out slowly, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. You've brought something back to Broken Spur that I thought was gone forever, something more than just good cooking and clean floors. Clara leaned slightly into his touch. What's that? Life, hope. His voice dropped lower. A reason to look forward to coming home at the end of the day, Clara's heart quickened. Vaughn, he leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. If I asked you to still be here when I return from Tucson, would you? Yes, she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of everything unspoken between them. For a moment, Clara thought Vaughn might kiss her, but instead he drew back slightly, his hand falling away from her face. I should finish preparations for tomorrow. It's a long ride to Tucson. Clara nodded, a mixture of disappointment and understanding washing over her. As she rose to return inside, Vaughn caught her hand. Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion, thank you for everything you've brought to this ranch, to me. She squeezed his hand once before slipping away, her thoughts in turmoil. Vaughn departed at dawn, promising to return within a week. The days that followed were tense at Broken Spur, with Sam organizing round-the-clock watches and the men staying close to the ranch buildings. Clara threw herself into work, baking extra bread and preserving late summer vegetables to keep her mind occupied. 5 days after Vaughn's departure, Clara was hanging laundry when she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. Her heart leaped with hope that it might be Vaughn returning early, but as the riders drew closer, she recognized James Blackwood at the head of a group of 6 men. Clara hurried to alert Sam, who immediately gathered the ranch hands. They were outnumbered. Miguel had taken 2 men to check on a distant pasture, leaving only Sam, Illy, Thomas, and Lewis to defend the ranch. Get inside, Miss Clara, Sam ordered, checking his rifle. Lock the doors and stay away from the windows. Clara obeyed, watching anxiously from a small side window as Blackwood and his men rode into the yard. Through the glass, she could hear the exchange of words growing heated. Laramie's not here, Sam was saying. Whatever business you have can wait until he returns. My business won't wait, Blackwood replied, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. I've come with a final offer for this worthless piece of land, generous considering recent mishaps. Mr. Laramie isn't selling, not now, not ever. Blackwood's laugh sent chills down Clara's spine. We'll see about that. Accidents happen so easily on isolated ranches. Fires, stampedes, tragic events. The threat hung in the air. Sam's response was drowned out by the sudden sound of a rifle being cocked. One of Blackwood's men had raised his weapon. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Shots rang out, men scattered for cover, and Clara found herself pressed against the wall, heart pounding as bullets splintered the window frame nearby. She heard Sam shouting orders, the answering fire from the ranch hands, and the frightening silence that followed when Thomas cried out in pain. Clara made a split-second decision. Grabbing the shotgun Vaughn kept mounted above the kitchen door, she moved swiftly through the house to the back entrance. If she could circle around, perhaps she could help Thomas or create a distraction. Outside, she crept along the side of the house, the shotgun heavy in her hands. She had never fired one before, but had watched Vaughn clean and load this weapon dozens of times. The gunfire had momentarily ceased, replaced by Blackwood's voice demanding surrender. Clara reached the corner of the house and peered around carefully. Thomas lay bleeding behind an overturned water trough, cut off from the others who were pinned down behind the remains of the barn. Blackwood and 3 of his men had taken positions that gave them clear advantage. Drawing a deep breath, Clara stepped out, leveling the shotgun at Blackwood. That's enough, she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Leave this ranch now or I will fire. Blackwood turned, surprise giving way to amusement as he saw her. Well, Laramie's housegirl has spirit. He took a step toward her. Put down that gun before you hurt yourself, miss. Clara stood her ground. One more step and you'll find out if I know how to use it. You won't shoot, Blackwood said confidently, taking another step forward. Not in cold blood. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. To protect this ranch and these men, yes, I would. Something in her voice must have convinced him because Blackwood halted, reassessing the situation. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Vaughn Laramie rode into the yard, flanked by Miguel, the 2 missing ranch hands, and 3 uniformed men Clara recognized as territorial lawmen. Vaughn's expression turned murderous as he took in the scene. Thomas wounded, his men under siege, and Clara facing down Blackwood with a shotgun. Marshal Davis, Vaughn called to one of the uniformed men. I believe you can now see firsthand the kind of neighborly visit Mr. Blackwood pays. The marshal surveyed the scene grimly. "Lower your weapons, all of you, now." In the tense aftermath, Clara's hands shook so badly that Vaughn had to gently take the shotgun from her grip. As the lawman arrested Blackwood and his men for attempted murder, Vaughn led Clara to the porch, away from the chaos. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," Clara managed, "but Thomas is wounded again. Not badly, I think." Vaughn's gaze never left her face. "What were you thinking, confronting Blackwood like that? He's killed men for less than a sideways glance." "I was thinking that I couldn't watch from safety while people I care about were in danger," Clara replied. "Just like I couldn't stay inside during the storm when you needed warning about the rustlers." Something broke in Vaughn's careful composure. Without warning, he pulled Clara into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "I rode back into my yard to find you facing down the most dangerous man in the territory with a shotgun you've never fired," he said hoarsely. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Clara clutched the front of his shirt. "I'm sorry for frightening you, but I'm not sorry for defending Broken Spur." Vaughn drew back slightly, his hands coming up to frame her face. "No, I don't suppose you would be." A hint of wonder entered his voice. "You love this place as much as I do, don't you?" "I love this place," Clara agreed softly, "and the man who built it." For a heartbeat, Vaughn went perfectly still. Then, with a groan that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him, he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when Clara responded by sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something fierce and claiming. When they finally parted, breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since you stitched up Thomas without flinching," Clara laughed softly. "I've wanted you to since the night of the storm." Marshal Davis approached, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Laramie, we need your statement about the events leading up to today." Vaughn reluctantly released Clara, though he kept one arm around her waist. "Of course, Marshal, and you'll want to hear Miss Calloway's account as well. She saw more of the initial confrontation than I did." Over the next few hours, order was gradually restored to Broken Spur. Thomas's wound was treated a graze along his ribs that looked worse than it was, and the marshal took detailed statements from everyone involved. By nightfall, Blackwood and his men had been escorted toward Tucson to await trial, and the ranch hands had gathered in the kitchen for a much-needed meal. Clara moved about the kitchen, serving food and pouring coffee, acutely aware of Vaughn's gaze following her. When the men finally dispersed to the bunkhouse, leaving them alone, Vaughn approached her as she wiped down the table. "I thought of you every mile to Tucson and back," he said without preamble. "Worried about leaving you here, wondering if you'd still be waiting when I returned." Clara set aside her cloth. "I told you I would be, I know." Vaughn reached for her hands, holding them in his larger ones. "Clara, I'm not an eloquent man. I can't quote poetry or write fancy letters. But I need you to know that somewhere between that first day at White Rock Station and watching you face down Blackwood with more courage than most men I've known, I fell in love with you." Clara's heart soared at his words. "Vaughn, let me finish," he said gently. "This ranch, this life, it's hard and sometimes dangerous. It's not what a lady like you deserves. But if you could see your way to staying, not as my housekeeper but as my wife, I swear I'd spend every day trying to make you happy." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "I don't want the life I left behind with its false propriety and empty conventions. I want this life, the honest work, the open skies." She squeezed his hands. "I want you, Vaughn Laramie, exactly as you are." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with such tenderness that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Why are you crying?" he asked, brushing away a tear with his thumb. "Because I never expected to find home in the place I was running to," Clara answered truthfully. Vaughn's expression grew solemn. "Marry me, Clara Calloway, be my wife, my partner, the heart of this ranch." "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times yes." News of the engagement spread quickly across the territory, bringing well wishes from neighboring ranchers and a flurry of activity at Broken Spur. Clara threw herself into preparations, determined that their wedding, though simple by Eastern standards, would be a joyful celebration of new beginnings. The trial of James Blackwood and his men resulted in lengthy prison sentences, bringing a sense of justice and security to the region. With that threat removed, Vaughn turned his attention to expanding the ranch operations, consulting Clara on each decision as a true partner. On a crisp October morning, Clara stood before a small mirror in her room, arranging the wildflowers Miguel's wife had woven into her hair. Her wedding dress was simple, a dove-gray silk she had ordered from Tucson, adorned with lace from her mother's veil that she had carried west in her carpet bag. A knock at the door announced Sam's wife, Martha, who had ridden over to help with the preparations. "It's nearly time, Clara." The ministers arrived and everyone's gathering in the yard. Clara took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. "How many people came?" "Half the territory, I think," Martha said with a smile. Word spread about the Eastern lady who faced down James Blackwood with a shotgun and captured Vaughn Laramie's heart in the process. Folks were curious. Outside, Vaughn waited beneath an arch of twisted branches decorated with autumn flowers. He wore a new black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair neatly trimmed and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. As Clara appeared in the doorway on Sam's arm, a hush fell over the assembled guests. With each step toward her future husband, Clara felt the rightness of her choice. This wild land that had once seemed so foreign had become home. These people who had been strangers were now family. And the man watching her approach with undisguised adoration in his eyes held her heart completely. When she reached him, Vaughn took her hands in his eyes widening slightly as he noticed the tears glistening on her lashes. "You're crying," he whispered, concern crossing his features. Clara smiled through her tears. "Happy tears, I promise." Vaughn's expression softened as he brushed a tear from her cheek. "You'll never cry alone again," he vowed, his voice carrying just far enough for those closest to them to hear. "Not as long as I live." The simple ceremony joined them as husband and wife before God and their community. When the minister pronounced them married, Vaughn kissed Clara with such reverence that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes, and even Gruff Ali was seen to clear his throat suspiciously. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and food aplenty. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Clara moved among their guests, her hand rarely leaving Vaughn's as they accepted congratulations and good wishes. Late in the evening, they slipped away from the celebration to stand on the porch, looking out over the land that was now truly their shared home. Vaughn wrapped an arm around Clara's waist, pulling her close against his side. "Happy, Mrs. Laramie?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Perfectly," Clara answered, leaning into his embrace, "though I still can't quite believe how much has changed in 6 months. When I stepped off that stagecoach at White Rock Station, I never imagined that you'd end up married to a rough cattleman in the middle of nowhere," Vaughn finished with a chuckle. Clara turned in his arms to face him, "that I'd find everything I never knew I was looking for." Vaughn's expression grew serious. "There will still be hard days ahead, Clara. Droughts, harsh winters, cattle sickness. This life doesn't get easier. But we'll face it together," she said with conviction. "That makes all the difference." He nodded, then gestured toward the celebration continuing in the yard. "Should we rejoin our guests?" Clara smiled mischievously. "Or we could start our married life properly. I believe our room now is empty." Vaughn's eyes darkened with desire. "Mrs. Laramie, I do believe that's the best suggestion I've heard all day." They slipped quietly upstairs to the master bedroom that Clara had prepared for their new life together. Fresh linens adorned the bed, wildflowers filled a vase on the dresser, and Vaughn's few possessions had been arranged alongside Clara's meager belongings. As the sounds of celebration continued below, Vaughn closed the door and turned to his bride. With infinite tenderness, he began removing the flowers from her hair, his fingers brushing against her neck in a way that made her shiver. "I've imagined this moment more times than I care to admit," he confessed, his voice husky. Clara reached up to loosen his tie. "So have I," she admitted, a blush coloring her cheeks. Slowly, reverently, they undressed each other, each touch an exploration, each kiss a promise. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it was with a passion born of months of longing and the deep connection that had grown between them through danger and hardship. Afterward, Clara lay with her head on Vaughn's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I love you, Clara Laramie," he murmured into her hair. "And I love you," she replied, lifting her head to meet his gaze. "More than I thought possible." As winter descended on Broken Spur, the ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm. Clara's position transformed from housekeeper to mistress of the ranch, though she still preferred to cook most meals herself rather than hire additional help. Her relationship with the ranch hands evolved too, with the men showing her a respect that went beyond mere courtesy to genuine affection and loyalty. Vaughn flourished with Clara by his side, his natural reticence giving way to a quiet contentment that was evident in everything from his more frequent smiles to the way he lingered over breakfast each morning, reluctant to leave her company even for a few hours. They worked as true partners, Clara learning the business side of ranching while teaching Vaughn the finer points of household management. In the evenings, they often sat before the fire, Clara reading aloud from one of the books she'd ordered from back east while Vaughn listened, sometimes asking questions that revealed a keen intellect beneath his practical exterior. Spring brought new life to the ranch, calves in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the hillsides, and the news that Clara was expecting their first child. Vaughn's reaction to the announcement was everything Clara could have hoped for, his joy unmistakable as he lifted her off her feet in a careful embrace. "Are you happy about this?" she asked needlessly, laughing as he set her down. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Vaughn replied, his hand gently resting against her still flat stomach. "A child, our child, I never thought I'd be fortunate enough to have both the woman I love and a family of my own." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. Vaughn grew increasingly protective, insisting that Clara rest more and allow the ranch hands to take on additional duties. She complied with his wishes to a point, but refused to be treated as an invalid. "This baby is half Laramie," she reminded him when he protested her continuing to work in the garden. "Stubborn and strong from the start." "God help us if that's true," Vaughn replied with a grin, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. On a crisp November morning, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Clara gave birth to a healthy daughter after a difficult but relatively short labor. Vaughn, who had paced the porch for hours under Sam's watchful eye, rushed to her side the moment Martha emerged to announce the birth. Clara lay exhausted but radiant in their bed, a small bundle cradled in her arms. As Vaughn approached hesitantly, she turned back the blanket to reveal a tiny face with a dusting of dark hair. "Come meet your daughter," Clara said softly. Vaughn sank onto the edge of the bed, his expression a mixture of awe and terror as he gazed at the infant. "She's so small, but perfect," Clara assured him. "Would you like to hold her?" With trembling hands, Vaughn accepted the precious bundle, cradling his daughter with infinite care. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your pa." The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but seemingly drawn to the sound of his voice. Vaughn's breath caught, and when he looked up at Clara, there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "For her, for everything." Clara reached out to touch his face. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed various possibilities over the months but had never settled on a final choice. Now, looking at their daughter's delicate features, Vaughn suggested, "What about Elizabeth, after your mother?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Elizabeth Victoria Laramie," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." The news of Elizabeth's birth spread quickly, bringing visitors to Broken Spur bearing gifts and good wishes. The ranch hands took to their role as honorary uncles with enthusiasm, particularly Sam, who carved a beautiful wooden cradle as a gift for the baby. As Elizabeth grew, so too did Broken Spur's prosperity. The following spring, Vaughn purchased adjacent land from a retiring rancher, nearly doubling their holdings. He hired additional hands and began experimenting with new breeding stock to improve their herds. Clara balanced motherhood with her duties as the ranch's mistress, often carrying Elizabeth in a sling as she moved about the house or yard. She started a small school for the children of the ranch hands, teaching reading and arithmetic 3 afternoons a week in the ranch's front room. 2 years after Elizabeth's birth, Clara gave Vaughn a son they named Joseph Samuel, after Vaughn's father and their loyal foreman. The boy had his mother's curly hair but his father's storm-gray eyes and determined expression. Life at Broken Spur settled into a pattern of seasons and celebrations, hard work and simple pleasures. The ranch became known throughout the territory not only for its fine cattle, but also for the warm hospitality offered by its mistress. Travelers passing through could count on a good meal, and if needed, a place to sleep, though Clara's reputation as the woman who had faced down James Blackwood ensured that visitors maintained impeccable manners. One evening, as their children slept and a gentle rain pattered against the windows, Clara found Vaughn on the porch, staring out into the darkness. She joined him on the bench, nestling against his side as his arm automatically came around her shoulders. "What has you so contemplative tonight?" she asked, noting his distant expression. "I was thinking about that day at White Rock Station," Vaughn replied. "If I hadn't stopped to check mail that afternoon, if you hadn't been sitting on that bench looking so proper and so lost at the same time." "Divine providence," Clara suggested, smiling up at him, "or extraordinary luck." Vaughn turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in the lamplight spilling from the window. "5 years ago, this was just land and buildings to me, something to work for, to defend, but not truly a home." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "You changed everything, Clara. You made Broken Spur a home and me a complete man." Clara leaned into his touch. "And you gave me exactly what you promised that day we married. I've never had to cry alone." She smiled, blinking back tears that proved her point. "Even my happy tears are shared." Vaughn brushed away a tear with his thumb before leaning down to kiss her softly. "I intend to keep that promise for the next 50 years, Mrs. Laramie." "I'll hold you to that, Cowboy," Clara replied, wrapping her arms around his neck to draw him closer. As they sat entwined on the porch of the home they had built together, with their children sleeping peacefully inside and the gentle rain washing the land they both loved, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her west. What had begun as an escape had become the greatest adventure of her life, finding strength she never knew she possessed, a love deeper than she had imagined possible, and a family that filled her heart to overflowing. The Eastern lady and the Western cowboy had forged something remarkable on this patch of wild land. A legacy of love, courage, and commitment that would endure long after they were gone, passed down through their children, and the stories told about the day she married the cowboy with tears in her eyes, and he promised she would never cry alone again.